We're in Isaiah 7, and this is dealing with the Syro-Ephraimitic War. Hope you read 2 Kings 16 and 2 Chronicles 28, because that really serves as the background of this chapter. In the first two verses, we have the historical setting. We have Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the king of Israel, were going to attack Jerusalem for not joining forces with them against Assyria. And so Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah were fearful, not realizing that in reality help should be found in God. In verses 3 through verse 9 then, we have a message of encouragement. And we had gotten down to verse 5 in our study, but going back to verse 3 and reading on through verse 9, he says, "Then the Lord said unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. And say unto him, Take heed, and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted, for the two tails of these smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria, and the son of Remaliah. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against thee, saying, Let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tebel. Thus saith the Lord God, It shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it shall not be a people. And the head of Ephraim is Syria, and the head of Syria is Remaliah's son. If ye will not believe, surely ye shall not be established." So, in these verses, you have that encouragement given to Ahaz. Isaiah told to go meet him, and be sure and take along Shear-Jashub, his son. Tells him where to meet him. And verse 4, which we discussed last week, he gives him 4 messages of comfort, if he would receive it. The first, take heed, in other words, to proceed carefully and cautiously, because his decisions are going to affect the entire nation. Second, be quiet. Be calm. Don't make any hasty decisions that you might regret later. Third, fear not. Don't be overcome with fear. God is the one who's really in control, and these nations that are coming against you, they really can't do anything. And 4, don't be faint-hearted or don't become weak or lacking in courage. These two nations and peoples had, he refers to them as two tails of these smoking firebrands. Basically, they're stumps now of smoldering firewood. At one time, they might have been dangerous, but now then they're not. Their power and their ability to harm was departing them and going out. So there's no reason to fear them. So in verse 5 then, because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against thee, saying, and going on into verse 6, but so Syria, Ephraim, and Pekah, who's the son of Remaliah, they had, as we see in this context, they've made a conspiracy to remove Ahab from being king. And they're going to place their vassal king upon the throne in Jerusalem. And basically that vassal king he's the son of Tebel, as we see in verse 6. He'll do whatever Syria and Ephraim want him to do. He will be in league with them. I think we mentioned at the very end last week the fact that Easterners express contempt by designating one using his father's name. Doesn't use his name. Doesn't mention Pekah here. It just mentions him as the son of Remaliah. That's especially true when the father was little known. Who's Remaliah? Well, he's the father of Pekah. Who is he? What did he do? You see, we don't really know him. Not that much, at least. And so here's a little known figure, and you're not even going to use the son's name. You're just saying he's the son of this little known figure out here. Someone turn over to 1 Samuel, the 20th chapter, and read verse 27 and then verse 31. 1 Samuel 20 and verse 27.
And it came to pass on the morrow, which was the second day of the month, that David's place was empty, and Saul said unto Jonathan his son, Wherefore cometh not the son of Jesse to me, neither yesterday nor today? 31. For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die.
Okay, this is King Saul. He's talking to his son Jonathan. And at this point in time, Saul is wanting to kill David because David has been appointed to be king. Saul, he's kind of out of his mind in hatred against David. And so he won't even use David's name to show contempt for David. He just calls him the son of Jesse. That's the same principle that we're seeing here in Isaiah in relationship to God's message to Ahab. And saying here, instead of using Pekah, his name, he just calls him the son of Remaliah. It's an aspect of contempt for that individual. And so in verse 6, let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tebel. So here's their plan. God is revealing the plan to Ahab, or Ahaz. Let's remove Ahaz from being king. We'll vex it. We'll vex Jerusalem and that area along with Ahaz. And make a breach. A breach is a division, dividing it. So they're going to divide it between the son of Remaliah and Syria. So reminds us of what took place with Germany after World War II. They made a breach in the land of Germany. Half of it going to, I didn't say half, Russia, and the other part's going to the other nations, the Allied nations. But there was a breach in Germany. That's what they're planning in relationship to Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. Well, we will divide it among ourselves, is what they're saying to each other. And then we'll set a vassal king up. over the rest of the land. That vassal king was going to be the son of Tabeel. Now, who is he? Who knows? We don't really know who he is. As far as I know, this is the only time that he's mentioned in the Bible. There's no real record of him from a historical standpoint. So this is the information that we have about him.
I bet all the unbelievers, just like they do the Hittites, sure seize on that. Say he's a mythical person.
I doubt it.
Well, they do it on one case.
There's a lot of things that they do catch upon to try and make their case, but I doubt that this would be one of them. Simply because we don't know who he is doesn't mean that he didn't exist. In relationship to the Hittites, who you mentioned, they denied their existence because there was no record of them as far as a nation and as far as a people are concerned, except in the Bible at that time. Later on, of course, it was discovered that they were a people, and there's the archaeological evidence for their existence. But as far as a single individual, they wouldn't catch upon that to try as evidence of the Bible not being inspired. They did. I think there was an entire city and, in fact, an entire nation, a territory, which they ruled over. And supposedly, if my memory serves me correct, they were a very great nation at one time. Just all historical accounts for many years were gone. We didn't have them, except from the biblical record. But the son of Tabeel, we just don't know who he is. No. Other than what is stated here, that's who they were planning on putting up as king over Jerusalem. Verse 7 then, thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. That ought to be a lot of comfort for Jerusalem and for Ahaz when God says it's not going to take place. Their plans basically were opposed to God's plans. God had a plan that involved Jerusalem and someone from the throne of David, or the seed of David, being king at Jerusalem. So here's these other people and the other nations who are making a plan. We're going to remove that, and we're going to set up our own kingdom over it, our own king over it. Their plans were opposed to God's plans. Thus, their conspiracy, their plans are going to fail. It will not stand. It will not come to pass. It's not going to take place. We continue in this to see that God is the one who's in control. If God was not in control, then this statement to Ahaz would really be pretty worthless. If I tell you that this is going to take place and I have no control over it, whether it does or not, what comfort is that going to bring to you? Well, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans, does it? God's in control. He, as we find in Daniel, raises up kings. He destroys kings based upon his decision, his will. That's why also he can give that dream to Nebuchadnezzar of 4 world empires that are going to take place. Why? Because he was in control of the situation. And all of the fighting, rebelliousness of man was not going to change God's plans along those lines. These 2 nations, as much as they would have liked to have destroyed Jerusalem, put up their vassal king, God says it's not going to happen. So in verses 8 and verse 9, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Reason. And within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If ye will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. Again, notice the, what's the word? Deliberately not saying Pekah's name. He mentions, okay, here's Syria. The head of Syria is Damascus. In other words, that's the capital city. The head of Damascus is Reason. He mentions his name, doesn't he? But it gets down here to Ephraim. Well, the head of Ephraim is Syria. That's, or Samaria. That was the capital city of Ephraim, the northern kingdom. Well, who's its king or its head? Well, it's Pekah. Oh, he doesn't mention Pekah by name. He just mentions him as Remaliah's son. There's total contempt by God to Pekah in this situation. But basically, God's order is going to remain, and their plans are going to be thwarted. The center of power, that's what he's dealing with. Here's head of Syria, Damascus. Head of Damascus is Reason. Here's Ephraim. Its head is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. It's going to remain that way. And he is saying also, in relationship to Reason, he's only going to be king at Damascus. He's not going to be king over here in Jerusalem. He's king at Damascus. That's all that he's going to have power over. Likewise, Pekah, Remaliah's son, while he's king of Ephraim, or Israel, ruling from Samaria, that's all he's going to be over. He's not going to be over Jerusalem. The center of powers are going to remain the same. They're not going to change. They're not going to expand their territories. And then he says, within 65 years. Now, how long is 65? 65. A score is 20 years, so 60 is 60, and then 5, so 65 years. He mentions thus, within 65 years, Ephraim, that's the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital city is Samaria, it will be broken in pieces. What God is looking to here is the Assyrian captivity. Assyria comes down and it captures Israel, and that was in about 722 BC, which was about 12 years after this time. But we're told about 65 years. It's interesting because in reality, their doom as a nation was sealed when the Assyrian rulers settled cities of Israel with colonists from the east at around 669 BC. Turn over to 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 24. And it says, "And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Catha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Saravaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof." So here's the king of Assyria bringing these from the east and settling them in Jerusalem, or in Samaria and the cities of Samaria. That was at 669. Now then, do a little bit of math. If you have 12 years to 722, and then you take 722 to 669, how many years is that? Just 722 to 669. How many years? 3? No, it's more. 722 to 669. We need to go back to there you go, 53 years. 53 years. I knew somebody would get it sooner or later. 53 years, though, from 722 to 669. 722 is when the Samaria was destroyed. 669, when the king of Assyria brings these other nations in. Add 12 to that 53. What do you get? 65. Where did we hear that number before? 65. Verse 8. 65 years shall Ephraim be broken. The city's destruction by Assyria, 722, but in 669, 65 years later from when Isaiah is told this, you have the king of Assyria bringing these nations in, and as a result, Samaria is broken, that it shall not be a people. When these colonists came in, they began intermarrying with the remnant of Ephraim, resulting in the fact that Ephraim then lost its identity. And thus, literally as is stated here, came to an end, it shall not be a people. Why? Because they had intermarried with these other nations and they lost their identity as a people. Now then, in conjunction with that, we often hear the phrase, the lost tribes of Israel. Were the tribes lost? They were dispersed and gone, but as a here's a distinction. As a people and as a nation, they were gone. They were not a people anymore. The tribes, though, remained. In the New Testament, in fact, you can read of people from the tribes of Ephraim. So they were still a people from the tribal aspect. As a nation, which is being discussed here, that nation of Ephraim, though, was destroyed. And in reality, what you have coming into existence, or starting to come into existence at this time, is the Samaritan people. Now, Samaritans were what?
Half-breed.
Half Jew and half Gentile. Or, as Dale put it, half-breeds. And the Jews thus despised them. They considered them lower than dogs. And that's because they were half-breeds. If you go back, or from this point in time, a little bit forward in time to the return from captivity that began in 536 BC under Zerubbabel. Later, there was one by Nehemiah and Esther, or Nehemiah and Ezra. And they started to rebuild the temple, and the Samaritans wanted to help. Said, we're part of you. And they said, no, you're not. You're not going to help. And so the Samaritans then started causing all sorts of trouble, wrote back to the king, got the work stopped for a period of time. But the origin of the Samaritans is this intermarriage that starts taking place at this point in time, at 669 BC, when the king of Assyria transplants all of these people from these other nations and other cities into Samaria. Questions about that? Comments? Bill?
I forget where it was, but wasn't there a problem with wild animals eating the people, and it's sent for a prophet or somebody to that the Assyrians inquired about a prophet or a teacher so they could go in and teach the people? Or
I'm trying to think of that event. I know that, you go to a little bit later on, Babylon. There's a prophecy against Babylon being rebuilt, and it would be a city where the animals would reside. But I don't think that's what you're talking about.
yeah, I can't remember where it was, but the people, the transplanted people were being killed off, or there was famine or something, and then like a teacher, a prophet, taught the people.
I don't recall. You might be there. I just don't remember it offhand. So, the last part of verse 8, if ye will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. This is in reality a warning to Ahaz, and also to broaden it out to the house of David, the southern kingdom of Judah. If they did not heed the warning that God was setting forth, they would not be established. Now, what does it mean they would not be established? Basically, it's saying that if you don't heed this warning, you're going to be destroyed. That's what it means by established. To establish their kingdom would be to set it up to make sure it continues. It's not going to continue. It's going to be destroyed if you don't heed the warning. So now then, in verse 10, Yes, ma'am.
If this, if he was being told that they were coming against him, and then Isaiah gave his word from God, but it said 65 years they would be destroyed, or they would be no more people, they would be broken. How would that be encouraging if he thought they could be going to be under attack now?
How would that be encouraging? Number one, also notice he says the head of Syria is Damascus, and that aspect, that's all they're going to control. They're not going to make any way, and from a long-term standpoint, 65 years, they will be not even be a people. Why worry about them? But the aspect in relationship to here and the immediate would be the first part of it. They're not going to be able to take control. In fact, in verse 7, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. That's their plans. So there's different aspects of the prophecy. What their plans will not take place. They're only going to control that which they control now. They're only going to be the head of it and nothing else. So they're not going to be able to come up and set up that vassal kingdom. And then 65 years, Ephraim, he's not talking now about Syria, but Ephraim, not even going to be a people anymore. So there's those three aspects in which he deals with. In verses 10 through verse 16 now, we have God's sign. Well, let's go ahead and read all of it, verse 10 through 16. Moreover, the Lord spake again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. And he said, Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will ye weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself, lost play. The Lord himself shall give you a sign. Where is that? There it is. Behold, I can't read that fast. Andrew, if you will type in, well, I think I can get it. I think I'm losing my batteries on this. Type in verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. Verse 10, God is speaking now to Ahaz. In verse 11, he tells him, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God, ask it in either the depth or in the height above. Going back to verse 11, Andrew, if you would. To give assurance to Ahaz then, Ahaz is given a an offering by God. Ask a sign. And he says in relationship to this sign, it can be either in the depth or in the height above. Now then, in effect, he is saying there's no limitation to this sign. Whatever you want, ask it. Depth or height. The word sign, Hebrew word oth, or ot, O-T. And it is a miracle or a mighty work of God. So we're dealing with God telling Ahaz, ask for a miracle. Whatever you want, whether it be here upon this earth, whether it be in the heavens, it doesn't make any difference. Whatever you ask. Now that's some offer, isn't it? By God. Who didn't? Gideon didn't. That's true. In fact, multiple times Gideon not only asked, he wasn't even offered, but he asked for a sign. Dale?
Let me ask you a question, please, that I've come across for the first time, I think ever, or I remember reading it. It says, for the Lord, in verse 19 of 2 Chronicles 28, for the Lord brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of Israel. I thought Ahaz was king of Judah. Is that a misprint?
No, it's Ahaz. There's another Ahaz that is king of Israel, or was king of Israel. We're dealing with Ahaz, the king of Judah. Two different individuals.
King of Israel. I must be messed up. I knew that guy.
And Ahaz, king of Israel, was married to Jezebel. That's right. Okay. But here, ask any miracle whatsoever. Have you ever talked to Pentecostals nowadays and you ask them to do a miracle? They claim miracles exist and happen. Okay, work a miracle. Let's go to the cemetery and you can raise someone from the dead. You're tempting God. You don't do that. Well, you mentioned Gideon did it. Ahaz here is told to do it. Now, what's the difference? Well, the difference is those were miracles. They can't do anything. It shows their lack of ability to do it. In verse 12 then, Ahaz says, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. Feigned piety, or fake piety or godliness. Oh, I'm too godly to ask God for a miracle like that. That's what he's basically saying. And asking for a miracle would, in reality, being tempting God. Someone turn over to Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16. Okay. Do not tempt the Lord your God. Ahaz might have been using that statement in regards to this, I will not ask the Lord, or I'm not going to do this. Well, don't tempt the Lord your God. And so if he was referring back to that, it was misuse of that. It is not a tempting of God to do what God said. God told him, ask for a miracle. Now then, he's basically refusing to do what God said. And so it's not tempting God, and to refuse to do it is, in reality, ungodly, and it's rebelliousness against God. And it shows the unbelief of Ahaz. Ahaz is worried about these two nations. God tells him they're not going to succeed. They're not going to be able to destroy you. They're not going to be able to set up this vassal king. They're going to be destroyed, in fact. And he's worried about all of that. God tells him this, and he's still scared about it. Some have suggested, and I think it's a good possibility, that Ahaz had already appealed to Tiglath-Pileser. Now, Tiglath-Pileser was the ruler of Assyria. Now, you have Syria and Ephraim making these plans. Assyria was the nation that they wanted to have. Well, these two, Syria and Ephraim, wanted Jerusalem, or southern kingdom, to join with them in fighting against Assyria. Some have claimed that Ahaz has already made an appeal to Assyria, and thus Tiglath-Pileser, and thus he doesn't really concern himself with what God is saying. Turn over to 2 Kings 16. And in verses 3 through verse 10, it says, "But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, yea, made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the heathen." This is talking about Ahaz now. "Whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. And he sacrificed and burned incense in the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria, and drave the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day." Now notice this. "So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria, and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him. For the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the fashion of the altar and the pattern of it, according to all the workmanship thereof." So here's the situation, and it states that Ahaz, what does he do? He appeals to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, to come and save him from these two nations. So now, the question is, at this time that we see here that God is giving this promise to Ahaz and telling him, ask of any miracle whatsoever, had Ahaz already appealed to Tiglath-Pileser, or was he planning to do it? or did that come up after the fact and after God's promise? Now then, the time frame as to this prophecy we don't know specifically in relationship to whether he had already appealed to Tiglath-Pileser or whether he was just in the planning stages of it. So when God makes this offer, ask for any miracle whatsoever, he feigns this respect for God. I won't ask God, I won't tempt God, while in reality he was rejecting God and God's offer. Now then, understand also, as we were reading there in 2 Kings 16, Ahaz was an idolater. He had brought in all these idols, sacrificed his son. If he accepts God's offer, what does that do to his idolatry? He has to reject his idolatry to accept God's offer. But what happens if he appeals to Tiglath-Pileser and Tiglath-Pileser saves him? He can retain his idolatry. So a lot of this, as to what we're seeing taking place here, goes back to the idolatry in which he was involved in. I can retain my idolatry by appealing to Tiglath-Pileser. So God makes the offer, ask for any miracle, because these things aren't going to take place, and he rejects that offer. We'll start thus with verse 13 then next week, Lord willing.